From New York, this is Democracy Now!
We saw a drastic increase in overdoses over the last year, including the death of my sister, Keely. And I just really feel that if we want to confront the overdose crisis, we have to end prohibition and criminalization.
Over 92,000 people died from drug overdoses last year, the highest since the CDC began keeping records. We'll speak to Truth Out's Maya Shenwar about her sister's death and why defunding the police might have saved her life. Then we speak to Democratic Congresswoman Nikema Williams of Georgia about her Abolition Amendment to end forced prison labor, as well as voting rights, and we'll talk about infrastructure spending.
As we build back better, investing in care will help get people back to work, create good-paying jobs, and create a stronger economy for everyone.
Plus, we look at the deadly building collapse in Miami, where 12 people are confirmed dead, 149 remain missing. Could there be a link to climate change and rising sea levels? We'll speak to a scientist. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Protests erupted in occupied East Jerusalem Tuesday after Israeli forces equipped with bulldozers entered the Palestinian neighborhood of Silwan and demolished a local business in the Al-Bustan area, claiming the butcher shop did not have a proper permit. Israeli soldiers used tear gas and beat protesters with batons. At least 13 Palestinians were injured. This is a Silwan resident.
Here, do you see this, everybody? This has only been constructed 2 months ago. It cost 300,000 shekels. I swear to God. And the merchandise is still in it.
At least 15 families in Al-Bustan are at risk of being dispossessed as Israeli forces have ordered them to destroy their own homes or pay the demolition costs. Israeli authorities have banned all new construction in the area and have earmarked the land to build a park. This comes as the Palestinian ambassador to the United Nations said Israeli occupation forces have demolished 72 buildings in the past 3 months, leading to the displacement of 78 Palestinians. The UN warns over 100,000 people in occupied East Jerusalem are at risk of displacement. The U.S. military could be just days away from withdrawing the majority of its troops from Afghanistan 2 months ahead of the September 11th deadline set by President Biden. Hundreds of troops are likely to remain in the country, though, assigned to securing the U.S. Embassy and airport in Kabul. The withdrawal comes as Taliban fighters have taken control of dozens of districts in recent weeks, and as the top U.S. military general in Afghanistan says, the country could be headed towards civil war. In related news, the House voted Tuesday to expedite visas for Afghans who've worked alongside U.S. troops. Last week, former military interpreters held a protest in front of the U.S. Embassy in Kabul to highlight their plight.
This is our rights that the United States governments give us visa, because if they don't give us the chance of visa, so it's clear that 100% we are dying, and the enemies every time, every day, just they want to kill us. We want to survive, and we don't want our kids become orphans.
Russia says it has tested its surface-to-air missile system and warplanes in occupied Crimea following the launch of Ukraine and NATO's military drills in the Black Sea, known as the Sea Breeze 2021. The joint exercise, which includes the U.S. military, will last 2 weeks and involves around 5,000 military personnel, 30 ships, 40 aircraft. Last week, Russia said its Navy fired warning shots and dropped bombs in the path of a British warship in the Black Sea that entered waters claimed by the Kremlin. Israel's new foreign minister, Yair Lapid, inaugurated its embassy in the United Arab Emirates Tuesday and is opening an Israeli consulate in Dubai today. It's the first visit to the UAE by an Israeli cabinet minister since the two countries normalized relations last year. In South Africa, former President Jacob Zuma has been sentenced to 15 months in prison after he failed to appear in court as part of a corruption inquiry. Zuma, who was forced to resign as president in 2018 amidst mounting corruption scandals, is accused of helping a prominent business family obtain state contracts and influence government policy. As the Delta variant threatens to hamper COVID-19 recovery efforts around the world, the Red Cross is warning Indonesia is on the edge of catastrophe as health systems struggle to keep up with the influx of patients. This is a nurse in Jakarta.
A lot of cases were dead on arrival because of a lack of beds. Patients had to wait until there are beds before they can be hospitalized.
In Brazil, COVID-19, which has killed at least 516,000 people, caused life expectancy to decline an estimated 1.3 years in 2020, a stark finding in the country where the second worst death toll after the United States. Here in the U.S., the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention estimates the Delta variant now represents around 1/4 of infections. Los Angeles County is advising fully vaccinated residents to continue masking indoors due to concerns over the highly transmissible variant. Al Jazeera is reporting nearly 800 workers on the Enbridge Line 3 pipeline in northern Minnesota tested positive for COVID-19 since construction began in December of last year. In November, healthcare workers and indigenous groups petitioned Governor Tim Walz to delay construction, fearing a COVID spike in rural and native communities. In medical news, researchers found the COVID-19 mRNA vaccines produced by Pfizer and Moderna may offer protection against the coronavirus for years. Patients may still need booster shots if the virus and its variants evolve significantly. Meanwhile, in housing news, the Supreme Court left in place a CDC-issued moratorium on evictions during the pandemic. That moratorium will expire at the end of July. The New York City mayor's race was thrown into disarray Tuesday evening after the Elections Board released an updated vote count for the Democratic primary, then hours later removed the new figures from its website, saying there was a discrepancy. Yesterday's new vote count had put frontrunner Brooklyn Borough President Eric Adams just over 2% ahead of former Sanitation Commissioner Catherine Garcia. The board later explained it accidentally counted 135,000 test ballots in its latest tally. This is the first time ranked choice voting is being used in citywide elections in New York. The city is expected to release updated results today. 124,000 absentee ballots also have yet to be added to the final result, which is expected in mid-July. In Arizona, Maricopa County officials will replace all voting machines that were turned over to a private company hired by Republicans to conduct a fourth audit of the 2020 election. The Maricopa County Board of Supervisors said the equipment, quote, could pose a risk to free and fair elections after being handled by Cipher Ninjas, the company with no record of working in election security that was hired, and whose CEO has promoted conspiracy theories claiming the presidential election was stolen. The U.S. House of Representatives voted Tuesday to remove Confederate statues on display in the Capitol building. The bill would replace a bust of Roger Taney, who wrote the 1857 Dred Scott decision denying citizenship to African Americans, with one of Thurgood Marshall, the first African American Supreme Court justice. The bill now heads to the Senate. Missouri Democratic Congressmember Cori Bush introduced the People's Response Act, which would send unarmed trained professionals to respond to mental health and substance use crises instead of police. Congressmember Bush said the program, quote, will transform public safety into a system of care rather than criminalization, healing rather than incarceration, and prevention rather than policing. The New York Times reports that far-right operatives infiltrated Democratic-affiliated groups across Western states during the 2020 election cycle to try to manipulate politics and reshape the U.S. electoral map. The Times expose reveals how a former British spy connected to the mercenary contractor Eric Prince recruited ex-operatives from the conservative group Project Veritas to gather dirt that could sabotage the reputations of people and groups considered threats to then-President Trump. Major funding for the effort came from Susan Gore, heiress to the Gore-Tex fortune. The operatives also targeted Wyoming Republican Governor Mark Gordon, whom Trump supporters considered far too moderate. In immigration news, the Supreme Court ruled asylum seekers who were previously deported and then re-entered the U.S. can be detained indefinitely. The case involved asylum seekers who were apprehended when re-entering the U.S. after deportation, even though many faced violent persecution, torture, and death in their home countries. The 6-3 ruling also allows the U.S. government to deprive those asylum seekers of their right to see a judge or be given a bond hearing while their cases are resolved, a process that could take months or years. This comes as BuzzFeed reports the number of imprisoned asylum seekers has skyrocketed under the Biden administration, nearly doubling from 14,000 early this year to 27,000 detained people in June. In New Jersey, immigrant justice advocates are denouncing the transfer of a group of 30 immigrants detained in a Newark ICE jail to an unknown location early Tuesday. Among them were men who'd recently started a hunger strike. The group Abolish ICE, New York, New Jersey, reports guards may have tried to end the strike by entering people's cells and macing them. The group said some were dragged out of their cells in their underwear. The immigrants' whereabouts are still unknown. In Canada, officials estimate dozens of people across British Columbia have died in connection with the record-shattering, climate change-driven heat wave that engulfed the western U.S. and Canada in recent days. Over 230 deaths have been reported in the region since Friday, around 100 more than would be considered normal in that time span. In Edmonton, Alberta, community outreach workers shifted their focus from COVID prevention to making sure unhoused people could survive the dangerously high temperatures.
There's going to be a lot of people going to be ending up in the hospital and being really, really sick from this because some of them don't know how to look after themselves.
And in the nation's capital, climate actions continued Tuesday as activists rallied on Capitol Hill. Over 500 groups signed on to a letter to Democratic leadership calling for an end to fossil fuel subsidies in any infrastructure or economic recovery bills. Democratic Congress members Ro Khanna, Ilhan Omar, Manette Baragan, and Earl Blumenauer spoke at the rally. This is Ebony Martin of Greenpeace USA.
The time is now for Biden to change. The time is now for us to shift and call for an elimination of fossil fuel subsidies. So I want you to get on the phone. I want you to call all day, every day. Get on their nerves. Let them know they work for us. That's right.
Climate actions continued today with protests planned at the White House. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman in New York, joined by Democracy Now! Co-host Juan Gonzalez in New Brunswick, New Jersey. Hi, Juan.
Hi, Amy, and welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world.
We begin today with a deadly scourge striking down people at an alarming rate. No, it's not COVID. It's drug overdoses. Over 92,000 people died from overdoses in the United States in the 12-month period ending in November, the most since the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention began keeping track over 2 decades ago. Many experts cite 2 factors for the surge in deaths: the pandemic and the increasing availability of fentanyl and other synthetic opioids. This all comes as the nation marks 50 years since President Richard Nixon declared a war on drugs June 17, 1971. We begin today's show with someone who lost her sister to an overdose just as the pandemic was starting. Maya Shenwar joins us from Chicago, where she works as editor-in-chief of the news website Truthout. Her sister Keely died of a drug overdose in February 2020 at the age of 29. Maya's piece about her death is just out. It's headlined, "My Sister Died of an Overdose. Defunding the Police Might Have Saved Her." Maya is the co-author of Prison by Any Other Name and author of Lockdown, Locked Out, Why Prison Doesn't Work and How We Can Do Better. Maya, welcome to Democracy Now! Our condolences on the death of your sister. The story you tell is heart-rending. Tell us the story of Keely, how she lived, she is also a mother, and how she died.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me. You know, my sister Keely was, as you said, a wonderful mother, a writer, an animal lover, and a friend. And she died last year thanks to a long cycle of criminalization. Keely was incarcerated for the first time when she was 15. And for the next 14 years, she was just cycling in and out of jail and prison, as well as alternatives like electronic monitoring and drug treatment. And the things that she was arrested for were always related to her addiction, even when they weren't drug charges. So she would go to prison. She would become even more deeply traumatized because that's what prison does. It traumatizes people. And she would emerge with even fewer opportunities and options. And then she would just go back to heavily using heroin to help deal with that pain. And I want to point out real quick, so heroin in a vacuum, just like any other drug, is not the problem. People, I think, can use most stigmatized drugs and be okay, even the most stigmatized drugs like heroin. But people are not supported in using drugs and being okay because they're criminalized. So while Keely was incarcerated, horrible things happened to her, like anyone who's locked up. She experienced violence that was perpetrated by guards. She experienced the daily violence that everyone experiences of strip searches and medical neglect and really just being called by a number instead of by your name. And also she experienced giving birth to her baby while she was incarcerated, and a prison guard was just sitting there watching her give birth. And when Keely returned to using heroin after her time in prison or a mandated treatment program, each time she was at a much greater risk of overdose. And this is something I really want to emphasize. This is true for so many people who use drugs who are released from prison. So within the first couple of weeks after being released, someone's risk of overdose is almost 13 times higher than it is for the rest of the population. And that's partly because your tolerance for the drug is lower because you haven't been using. So last year, my sister was in a drug treatment program, a drug court program, so mandatory treatment, and it was based around abstinence, not using the drug. And so her tolerance was reduced. And she was also very scared of being rearrested because she knew that that would mean returning to prison and being separated from her daughter again. And so she was avoiding seeking any kind of medical help because it could mean police involvement. So at that point,
Maya, I wanted to ask you, in terms of when she was out of prison, what kind of medical or therapeutic help did she receive during those periods of time? And also, you've said that her interactions with police made her situation worse, not better. If you could talk about that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So while she was out of prison, she would occasionally receive some support. She tried to be engaged in medication-assisted treatment, which has proven to support people with heroin addictions. But so much of the treatment that she experienced was based around surveillance and policing. And this is something that we see with many, many people who are criminalized and also use drugs, because it's inside of the criminal legal system. So we see substance use as a problem that is within the criminal system, even if we're not sending people to jail. And so when people are sent to a mandated drug treatment center, when treatment is mandated, the research shows that that's not actually effective in helping people recover. And also we have to think about ethically, whether we should be putting people in a position where they're mandated to do certain things with their bodies and their minds. And so Keely was always surveilled, and she was not able to do the things that many of us are able to do to create a meaningful life. She wasn't given opportunities to pursue, her interests, to be with her family in a sustained way. Many of these treatments actually separated her from her family and confined her, just like prison. And then the thing I mention often about policing and the role that it played in her death was she became so afraid of being rearrested. And this is a very common fear among people who use drugs, and particularly among marginalized people who use drugs, Black people, Indigenous people, trans people, people with disabilities and mental health diagnoses. Police are targeting them very, very heavily. So it's a warranted fear. And so seeking any kind of medical attention, particularly calling 911, can put you at risk for police contact. And that can lead to a return to incarceration. So even when, in theory, there are options available and people say, well, why didn't you seek help? It's like, well, why would you seek help if the threat of punishment and torture and trauma is just hanging over your head every single second of the day?
And I wanted to ask you, in 2019, Keely was sentenced to 2 years in drug court. Explain what that means and what happened to her after that.
Yeah. So drug court is a diversion. So the idea is that someone will be diverted either pretrial or sentenced to treatment instead of prison. And this option has grown substantially in popularity over the past few years. And it's something that Biden has heavily promoted. It's often a thing that generates bipartisan enthusiasm. But what people aren't acknowledging is it's still criminalization. So it still involves arresting people. Just arrest is a trauma. It's within the criminal legal system, which is built on foundations of white supremacy. And so it's still targeting people of color, targeting Black people. It's still operating within a mindset of surveillance. So drug testing people constantly. It's still operating within a model of abstinence, which we know is not actually the best way to help people survive. And so even though we know all these things, we're endorsing this program, I think, partly because it's so hard to break out of this punishment mindset. And we need to challenge ourselves and say, what are we doing? Why are we supporting criminalization at the expense of people's actual survival and ability to find support and ability to find resources? I think one really sad thing about all the money that is going into drug policing and drug courts and all of these resources not only are harming and killing people, but like the defund police movement has brought up again and again, what could we have if we diverted those resources and spent even more resources as well on things like housing and education and non-coercive healthcare and mental health care and more recreational opportunities and the arts and ways for people to live meaningful and livable lives and have all kinds of options to support their survival. That's where we should be directing our energy.
Maya, I'd like to go back to June 2014 when your sister, Keely Shenwar, participated in a panel discussion in Chicago on breastfeeding and incarceration. Keely read a poem she wrote for her baby daughter while she was incarcerated. Keely gave birth while she was in prison, was taken away from her newborn daughter only after 24 hours with her.
It took me over a month to start writing. It's so hard for me to think about all I've already put you through. Nurses give me updates when the counselors here let me call. They say you're almost 10 pounds, starting to feel better, and that you love your baths. I'm not the one that holds you when you cry, or the one that you look at when you open your eyes. It kills me to know that the reality is I'm not a part of your life. I brought you into a world full of great things that are surrounded with pain, which you already know too well. And I have no choice but to let you handle it all on your own and without a mother. I guess you're not alone. It doesn't make sense, or it doesn't matter. Nothing about this feels right. Although I know you won't remember this, I can't help but wonder if you feel the emptiness I carry day and night without you close or anywhere in sight. I know my handwriting is sometimes sloppy, but it's late and I'm writing in the background of the dim prison hallway lights. I'm about to miss your first Halloween, just as I've missed these last 2 months. I wish none of this was true, but deep inside, underneath a whole lot, I know I need to tell you nothing but the truth, which also includes that I love you. I'll spend the rest of my life making this up to you.
That's Keely Shenwar back in 2014. I'm so sorry, Maya, how difficult this is for you, which makes it all the more brave for you to have written this piece and truth out and to tell your sister's stories and her truths. As we talk about her baby being taken away from her so quickly, can you talk about her terror to get help because she was always afraid she'd lose her baby, that they'd take her baby from her, and what you think needs to happen now? And if Cori Bush's new resolution that she just introduced into Congress, the People's Response Act, which would send unarmed trained professionals to respond to mental health and substance abuse crises instead of police, would make a difference.
Yes, thank you, Amy. Thank you for playing that poem. I'm overwhelmed. The poem is so beautiful, but it shouldn't have had to be written. Tearing a mother away from her newborn baby is one of the most violent acts in the universe, and it's perpetrated by our legal system. And I think when we think about the terror of Keely, and so many mothers and parents who use drugs and more generally who are criminalized, we have to think about this double punishment. The fact that not only are they under threat of being put into torture chambers, prisons, but also they're under threat of this deep, deep wrenching punishment of being torn away. And of course, for Keely, that was also the trauma of actually being pregnant and giving birth behind bars. And when we look forward and think about, well, what can be done? I think the number one thing we need to be thinking about is end criminalization and policing. And this might sound like something we're doing away with instead of introducing, but I think it's generative because criminalization and incarceration are traumatizing and torturing people. And they're also putting us in the mindset that this is all we can do, that this is our go-to solution. Well, you can't actually administer treatment through a system like that. And as we've discussed, police are actually making it less likely that people are going to seek emergency help when they really need it. And so I think that within that, we also need to look at some of the other demands that are being made by organizers working to defund the police and to defend Black lives. And I think Cori Bush's legislation does encompass some of that. We need to be fueling resources toward priorities that affirm life, and that includes housing, education, food, healthcare. These things would absolutely reduce overdoses in addition to all the other many benefits they would have and the ways in which they would build toward creating a more flourishing and meaningful and equitable society. And I think creating non-police emergency responses is definitely something we should be funding and fueling. I believe Cori Bush's bill actually puts funding into existing programs, which is good. And we also need to be lifting up and funding and supporting all of the mutual aid efforts and the efforts that have actually been created by people who use drugs to support people in their survival, come up with creative harm reduction techniques, and actually bring those to the community. And I think that in addition, I just want to say real quickly that actually legalizing drugs and doing that in a way that's informed by racial justice, that grants reparations to people most impacted by the drug war, that also has to happen too, as we're talking about all these issues with people dealing with contaminated drugs, people dealing with overdoses when they didn't even realize what amount they were taking. So I think it's all of these things together with a mindset of freedom and supporting people in their survival, a mindset of healing and liberation, instead of the idea that you can confine and surveil and police people into so-called recovery.
Maya Shenwar, I want to thank you so much for being with us. Again, this is a conversation we will continue. Maya is editor-in-chief of Truth Out. Her sister, Keely, died of a drug overdose in February 2020 at the age of 29. Maya's piece about her death is just out. We'll link to it. It's headlined, "My Sister Died of an Overdose. Defunding the Police Might Have Saved Her." Maya Shenwar is co-author of Prison by Any Other Name and author of Lockdown, Locked Out, Why Prison Doesn't Work and How We Can Do Better. Next up, we'll speak with Democratic Congressmember Nikema Williams of Georgia about her Abolition Amendment to end forced prison labor. We'll also talk with her about voting rights and infrastructure spending. Stay with us.
I am a mother. I love and protect and clean up the messes. I am a mother. I am a nurse when you're sad or you're hurt and there's nowhere to turn. I'll help with the burden. Oh, there's so much you don't know about me. And if you walked in my shoes, then you might see I'm more than all of my mistakes, more than moments I have strayed, more than all the wrongs I've done and that I'll ever do. And if you take a second look under the cover of my book, I think you'd realize that I'm no different than you. So please don't judge me just by what I've done before, 'cause I am so much more. So much more.
So Much More by We Amplify Voices featuring Effie. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez as we look now at a new Abolition Amendment that was reintroduced after President Biden signed legislation this month to create a federal holiday commemorating June 19th as Juneteenth, the day in 1865 when enslaved people in Galveston, Texas learned of their freedom more than 2 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Some human rights advocates say Juneteenth didn't actually mark the end of slavery in the United States because of a clause in the 13th Amendment that bans the enslavement of people with the exception of involuntary servitude as punishment for being convicted of a crime. Now, Oregon Senator Jeff Merkley and Georgia Congressmember Nikema Williams have reintroduced legislation to amend the 13th Amendment. For more, we're joined by Jorge Renaud, the National Criminal Justice Director for Latino Justice. He was previously incarcerated for over 27 years in Texas, where he picked cotton, chopped trees, and did road work. He's joining us from Austin. And joining us from Washington, D.C., is the sponsor of this amendment, to the amendment, Congressmember Nikema Williams. It's great to have you with us for the first time as you replace John Lewis in Congress. We'll talk about voting in a bit, but let's start with this. Can you talk about what's called the Abolition Amendment?
Absolutely, Amy. Thank you for having me. I think we need to look at exactly where we are in our country right now. We're in a period of reckoning with our country's history. just yesterday on the House floor, we voted to remove statues of people who voluntarily served the Confederacy in this country. We saw what happened on January 6th. We came together as a country and voted in a very bipartisan, since people like to use that word so much, bipartisan fashion to make Juneteenth a federal holiday. But yet we still have our country's founding documents. Our Constitution has an exception for slavery. And the history of this country is marked with racism and white supremacy and oppression. And it's up to us to do something about it. So eliminating the loophole in the 13th Amendment that still allows for slavery, if people have been convicted of a crime, is one way to continue to move forward with addressing the problems of our past and building for the future. I think I hear a lot of people say, but it's not really happening and there's no slavery like really happening in the country. Then what's the problem with removing it, Amy? What I know and what I've seen from history is some laws are put on the books and some things are in place just so that they can be used in certain instances for certain people. So I am working with my colleague in the Senate to make sure that we get this done. We've seen that there's some states that have already removed this from their state constitution. Very red states like Nebraska and Utah, they had constitutional amendments and took it to the voters. And the voters in their states agreed to that this loophole was unacceptable. And it's time that we do that on the federal level.
And Congresswoman, a lot of people are not familiar with this history of this enslavement provision, especially in penal facilities. The state of Alabama, by the turn of the century, about a third of its revenue came from contracting out prison labor.
Yeah, I mean, if you go just back to the history of this country when Black codes were put in place, and that's why the exception was initially there, so that these Black codes that were put in place were the same people that were just freed. You could arrest them for loitering. You could arrest them for minor infractions and then put them right back in the fields that they were just freed from. And this has continued to play into this mass incarceration system that we have in this country that we all know disproportionately impacts Black and brown people.
And Jorge Renaud from the National Criminal Justice Director for Latino Justice, welcome to Democracy Now! Could you talk about the Abolition Amendment, what you hope it might achieve?
Yeah, thank you. Good morning. First, I want to say it's an honor to be here with the Congresswoman from Georgia. Yeah, first, I want to say a couple of things. And I think that one of the ways that we're going to have to begin this is with how we frame it and how we talk about this. In introducing this segment, the comment was made that some activists say that this is happening the way it is. I think objectively speaking, that is actually part of the Constitution. And right now there are something like 2.3 million people incarcerated in American cages, right? 1.8 million of them in prisons across the country who own nothing, who are told to go to work whenever the administration wants them to go to work, whose work and labor benefit 96% of the work that is done by individuals who are incarcerated in American prisons benefits the local government and doesn't benefit private corporations, right? So I think that what we have to do first is we have to recognize that American prisons are run by incarcerated labor, right? The only thing that guards do in this country is pass out mail, turn keys, and count individuals. Everything else, from cutting grass, from doing the electrical work, from doing the maintenance work, from cooking and cleaning and washing dirty underwear, everything is done by incarcerated individuals who in 5 states don't get anything at all for their labor, which means that this country is built upon the concept, right, upon the idea that ambition and initiative is something good, that you could pull yourself up by your bootstrap, right? However, you can go into an American prison and come out 25 years later not have a penny to your name. And I think even worse than the enforced poverty, right, that is inflicted upon those individuals is the idea that their labor, that themselves, that is not worthy at all. Right, that they have no input into what they do while they're incarcerated, right, and that they're not, and that none of their work is beneficial to when they get out.
Jorge, one of the reasons we call Democracy Now! News with a heart is we go to the people who are closest to a story. Right. You are not just an armchair commentator on this issue. You experienced it. You were in prison for 27 years in Texas, where you picked cotton, chopped trees, did road work. Can you talk about how this amendment would affect you?
Okay.
If this were passed while you were in prison.
Yeah. But the thing is, it would still affect me in a way, because I just went to New York for 3 days, right? And I had to go down to the Board of Pardons and Paroles and get permission in order to travel. And I had to show it to law enforcement. And that's kind of analogous to the slave papers, right? That when slaves were allowed to travel, right, back over 100 years ago, they had to get permission from their masters. So while I was incarcerated, I think, one, it would have allowed me in a way to pursue employment or education or vocational work while I was incarcerated that was meaningful to me, right? Something that I could build upon for when I got out. It would have allowed me to say, you know what, this specific job that has to be done in prison, right, that you may or may not pay me for, however, is one that's going to be conducive to my skill set. It would allow me to say the work that I am doing while I am incarcerated is meaningful to the community around me, which are the other individuals who are also incarcerated, right? It would have allowed me to think, I matter, I mean something. As it was, I was put in solitary confinement because I told the people the last time that I was incarcerated 2 years in, when I was working out in the fields, that I was tired of doing slave work and field work, and they put me in solitary, and they told me, you are going to do what we tell you to do when we tell you to do it. They beat me, and they carried me in the building, and they locked me up in solitary confinement. So I think it would have put a stop to some of that, right? Yeah.
How many, very quickly, did you get paid, and how many states pay no wages at all?
5 states right now pay no wages at all. I was given $50 when I was released, and I was given a bus ticket to Austin, which was where I had told the parole board I was paroling to. So, no, I was not paid not one penny for all the labor that I did.
And I'd like to get back to Congresswoman Nikema Williams. Wanted to ask you what you see as the prospects for this legislation, especially given the very close division in the Senate and in the House as well, but especially in the Senate.
So this is something that I think could pass on a bipartisan level. We've seen a willingness of some Republicans to come to grips with our nation's history and stand on the side of what is right. This was a bipartisan bill when it was introduced in the last Congress, and we are working through this. So I am hopeful that we will see people standing up to say that once and for all, we're going to end the exception for slavery in our Constitution. We're still working on it. It was just introduced recently, so there's still so much more work to do. We need people to be calling their members of Congress and calling their senators and voicing their concerns. A lot of members don't even know this exists. When I introduced it, I started talking to some of my Democratic colleagues, and they didn't realize that there is still an exception in the U.S. Constitution for slavery.
Congressmember Nikema Williams, while we still have you on, today the House is voting to create a select committee that'll investigate the deadly January 6th attack on the U.S. Capitol, while House Republican leaders still aren't saying whether they'll participate in the panel. Can you explain what's happening here after they voted down having this bipartisan investigation of what happened, how this affected you as you first came into Congress? And the fact that the Department of Homeland Security has just issued a bulletin talking about possible extremist right-wing violence happening in August.
So I experienced this attack on the Capitol my 3rd day of being a member of Congress, having just been sworn in. And it came at a very pivotal time for me, especially as a member representing Georgia. I had been up the entire night talking with media about our 2 U.S. Senate races that we just won here in Georgia. So the attack on the Capitol is juxtaposed against the winning 2 Senate seats in Georgia, sending a Black man and a Jewish man to represent the Deep South, and then me sitting in my office, getting ready to go on the floor and defend the Electoral College votes in Georgia, seeing a Confederate flag paraded through the halls of the rotunda of the United States Capitol, was jarring to me. And this constant reminder that I'm operating in a system that wasn't designed for or by people who look like me. But Amy, I am determined to make it work for all of us. And so as we move forward, I clearly understand that there are some people who don't think that I deserve to be here. And whether they are willing to say it as a member of the body that we're serving in, they clearly support their constituents back home who uplift this mantra. And so I applaud Speaker Pelosi for moving forward and coming up with the select committee, even if it is not bipartisan, because we have to get to the truth. We have to do the investigations, to do the hard work, have the hard conversations so that we can keep people safe. When all of this first started, I started getting threats, death threats. I had to have security for me, my family. I have a 5-year-old son, and I signed up to serve the people, but I never imagined that I would be unsafe as a member of Congress.
I also wanted to ask you, Congressmember Williams, about the emerging so-called bipartisan infrastructure spending deal. President Biden went to La Crosse, Wisconsin yesterday and said a failing infrastructure is, quote, a drain on our economy. The White House says the deal doesn't include any new taxes. It would see the U.S. spend over $579 billion on new infrastructure over 5 years, with some $300 billion going to transportation, $100 billion earmarked for roads, bridges, and other major projects. It does not include funding for major programs championed by progressives, including investments in green energy jobs and funds to combat the climate crisis, as we are experiencing the worst heat ever in this country, not to mention Canada as well. Portland broke every record, one of the hottest places on the planet right now. That's Portland, Oregon, just to name one place. In a moment, we're going to talk about what happened in Florida with a catastrophic collapse and its connection, possibly, to the climate crisis. But what about this? The demand that the linking the bipartisan infrastructure plan with the much larger one that Bernie Sanders and others are crafting.
So the House of Representatives has equal power in Congress to the Senate. And we need to make sure that the American people understand that. And frankly, that the United States Senate understands that. Speaker Pelosi has made it crystal clear that the House will only vote on the bipartisan deal once the larger infrastructure deal is passed through reconciliation. I applaud her for that, because we have some challenges in this country that we must address. And we have a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to be bold and visionary as we rethink infrastructure, as we truly look at a transformational package that will help us build back better. That shouldn't just be a tagline. We can't just go back to where we were before. We have to make sure that we're coming out of this pandemic stronger than ever before, creating jobs for everyone and making vital investments for our future. And that includes things like making sure that childcare is a part of what we think about when we think about infrastructure. Our care infrastructure keeps the economy going. And so I know that going too small and reaching this compromise will cost us so much more in the long run. And so I stand with my colleagues in the Congressional Progressive Caucus that we have to do both of these things concurrently.
Hello. Yes, Congresswoman, I know you have to go, but I just want to ask you quickly about what are the key infrastructure needs of your state that you're concerned about in this compromise measure? And could you talk about this magic of a $1 trillion project with no new taxes?
So that is still being worked out. The infrastructure needs of each district, we've had an opportunity to weigh in on. I've done infrastructure tours of every city in Georgia's 5th Congressional District. I've seen the bridges that need repair. I've seen the roads that need repair. I've seen also how we need to be addressing the inequities of the past and reconnecting communities, because the 1956 Federal Highway Act intentionally divided Black communities and decimated Black wealth in our country. Atlanta leads the country in being the worst in economic immobility and the racial wealth gap. And so as we're looking at how do we look at things in Atlanta that I know we need to do, like our bridges and our roads and our water systems, we also have to look at things that were done intentionally to some of our communities. And so I have to always view this through an equity lens. And what I do know about paying for this, anyone who makes less than $400,000 a year will not see 1 penny increase in their taxes. So I am ready to move forward on this. I know that I have a lot of colleagues in the House that are with me on this, and we're just ready for the Senate to do their job, and we're going to do ours.
Congressmember Nikema Williams of Georgia, thank you so much for being with us. We also want to thank Jorge Renaud of the National Criminal Justice Director for Latino Justice. Next up, we look at the catastrophic building collapse in Miami Beach, where 12 people are confirmed dead, 149 still missing. Could there be a link to the climate crisis and rising sea levels? We'll speak with a scientist. Stay with us.
Now. Just another link in the chain. Whoa, another link in the chain. I'd like to be something special, but I'm just a link in the chain. Another link in the chain. My fathers had fathers before them.
Just another link in the chain by the Prison Music Project and Zoe Bookbinder. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. In Florida, the death toll has risen to 12, with nearly 150 people still missing following the catastrophic collapse of the 13-story apartment building in Surfside, right next to Miami Beach. On Thursday, President Biden's scheduled to visit the site with Dr. Biden, his wife. The state attorney for Miami-Dade County has announced she would ask a grand jury to examine what may be the deadliest collapse of a residential building in U.S. history. A 2018 inspection found the building had abundant cracking and spalling in its foundation, with engineers pointing to design flaws and insufficient waterproofing. Less than 3 months before the collapse, the president of the Condominium Association warned residents that the damage had, quote, gotten significantly worse. Just last week, a pool contractor took photos underneath the building's pool deck showing water damage and cracked concrete. While investigators have not determined the exact cause of the collapse, the disaster raises new questions about how rising sea levels will impact oceanside buildings in Miami and other cities. We go now to Coral Gables, Florida, where we're joined by Harold Wanless, professor of geography and urban sustainability at the University of Miami. He leads a project called The Invading Sea, a collaborative effort by news organizations across Florida to address the threat of sea level rise. Dr. Wanless, you say soon, in fact, Miami will be underwater. But talk about that relevance today to what we are seeing in all of the carpet coverage of this catastrophe that has taken place. Rarely do we hear the words climate change.
Right. Well, since the building was built, there has been about 7-8 inches of further sea level rise, which is very fast. But if that building was built properly, I would be surprised that would have a major effect. If we look to the future, which maybe we can do in a minute, that would be important. I think the problem with this building is there may be some design and there may be certainly some maintenance problems. But I think they need to look very carefully at the elevation of the base of the parking garage, which you go down to go into, I believe. And that was much lower. And they also are going to need to look at very carefully exactly what this building was built on. We assumed it was sand of the Barrier Island overlying rock, but that may not be correct. There's some evidence that something else was dug out and filled back in, and we need to look at that. But, the reason this is so important is that either this is something unique to the building or this is a general problem that all the condos along the coast of the world are going to have to deal with, because certainly there is salt spray. And certainly during exceptional tides, you do get salt water into the groundwater. There's often fresh water. But even fresh water on concrete that isn't that good is highly corrosive. So, yeah.
And Dr. Wanless, could you talk about the impact of salt water on structures? Because we see this in New York City all the time on highways that are right along the water, that they're constantly having to repair them because of the corrosive nature of the salt.
That's right. And in contrast, Flagler built the railroad down to Key West in the early part of the previous century, and he used some German concrete that was designed for salt water, and we do it all the time with bridges and other structures around the world. So, and the problem is I don't think we're using the proper quality concrete because, it could be in 20 to 30 years, we could have as much as 2 to 3 feet of further sea level rise. Ice melt is really accelerating our sea level rise, and so we're really in for it. And so we have to deal with the question you asked straight up. It's it's not, well, this is above sea level. No, it's not really above sea level in the near future.
And can you talk about Miami, its future?
Miami's future? Well, because we've warmed the ocean, almost all the heat from global warming is in the ocean. Because that warmed ocean and the warmed atmosphere is now and has initiated and is rapidly accelerating ice melt on both Greenland and Antarctica, we are, as I said, certainly going to be in for a 2 to 3 foot further sea level rise by mid-century, a mortgage cycle away only. And we could be at 8 to as much as 15 feet by the end of the century. So Miami, well, there's only 3% of Miami-Dade County is greater than 12 feet above sea level. And even at 6 feet, it's pretty well going to be over later this century. So, but we're building here like there's no tomorrow. Maybe that's correct. It's a hard thing for people to think that this hasn't always been here, but it hasn't. Sea level just happened to slow down for the last couple thousand years, and so we built like this has always been here. And it unfortunately, the barrier island of Miami Beach and all the barrier islands of the world are going to be inundated, compromised, eroded, storm surged across more aggressively in the pretty near future. So,
and could you talk about the government policy related to this in places like Miami or New Orleans, that it's actually to build much more, spend billions on constructing man-made barriers instead of relocating populations and having the whole country have to pay for folks who want to live by the ocean? And we just have 30 seconds.
That's a very good question. And it's the same question on floodplains, where we're now having more aggressive floods. But this is a very fair question. And I don't think there's an easy answer for it. The problem with Miami, we live on very porous limestone. So you can't put a dike or a levee around us and keep the water out. It'll come right up through the rock.
Dr. Harold Wanless, we're going to be back with you soon. Critical analysis, professor of geography and urban sustainability at the University of Miami, leading a project called The Invading Sea. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.